Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. Hello, John.
Hi, mate.
Pretty serious times.
Serious times, and usually you ask me how I am. Today, I am actually quite angry about the Reserve Bank and this interest rate cut and the logic of it and where policy is going and where this country is going. Because a lot of our viewers have got kids. I got kids. I'm thinking about what the next few years is going to lay out for my generation, my kids' generation, about where are we going as a country, and we're completely headed in the wrong direction.
Yep. Well, the much signalled rate cut happened, right? But we need to understand the context for it and the implications of it, because it's been spruiked the wrong way, in my view, in the media, and people are missing the key issues.
Absolutely. So we've got the lowest official cash rate on record in Australian history, and the governor basically said two reasons for why the board decided to cut. One was slack in the labour force. So basically, more people can get jobs, and they need to give more stimulus for those people to find jobs. Number one, so more demand management, Keynesian sort of management. And the second point was that inflation is persistently lower than the inflation target of 2 to 3%, and they need to get inflation up. So here's the thing: we've got cost of living as the number one economic issue in the country, and the governor is saying we need to exacerbate cost of living so that we can meet some artificial BS target. Now the reality is that you've done a post on Walk the World about how systematically rigged the CPI is. If anyone comes to my website, adamseconomics.com, I've written an article about the CPI. The RBA in 1998 was pinnacle to removing, for example, land out of the CPI. Now, if land was in the CPI, all of this house price inflation would be properly captured, and inflation would be running at a much higher rate than what the CPI is. So this whole thing, 2 to 3%, and that's what we've got to target. Well, the whole framework of monetary policy is completely flawed. It's wrong. The statistics they're using have been corrupted by the Reserve Bank and the establishment to lie to the people about what the real rate of inflation is. And yet here we have the biggest bubble in the history of the world, and we've got a governor now saying, well, we need to, because all of this, he's talking about inflation and employment. What's the real story? The real story is we've got this bubble, and he's trying to inflate the bubble and not to see the bubble collapse on his watch. That's what's really going on, and we're now getting to the stage of, this is not sound policy. This is reckless policy, and the future direction of policy in the next 18 months is even more reckless.
Sure, and you can take this in so many places. But I just want to focus on your point about importing inflation. In their statement, they actually said higher petrol prices will be good.
Yes.
Can you believe it?
Absolutely. Yeah. High petrol prices in the next few months will lift the official rate of inflation up to this artificial 2 to 3%, and that will be good because they can say, well, we've met our target. And again, which rational economist will say that if cost of living for the middle class is the number one economic issue, and we're going to make it tougher for people to put petrol in their cars, that's actually a good economic outcome? This is the absolute insanity that we're seeing out of Martin Place, and yet the mainstream media continue to run absolute propaganda, at the level of Goebbels, to say that this is a great guy, this is great policy. Common sense would dictate that these guys are literally out of control.
Yeah. If you ask anybody on the street, do you want your petrol prices higher or lower? No one is going to say higher, right? And we know from our household surveys that people are really struggling. We've got more people already today in a cash flow bind, and now we're going to import in more inflation and lift cost of living even higher. It just makes no sense at all.
Exactly. And the other point is, because if anyone goes to the RBA website, so there was the decision that was released at 2:30, and then the RBA governor gave his speech last night, and the speech is up there. So in the speech, he basically said that there was a concern around household debt, but that the concern around household debt, that has gone away. Now, I want to read the statement because, again, I mean, there is no way to explain what this guy is saying. I mean, he's just making stuff on the fly that have absolutely no rational basis, no empirical basis for it. So let's go to the statement. This is the RBA governor last night. Over the past few years, one concern has been that lower interest rates could add to the medium-term risks facing the Australian economy as a result of high household debt. We need to keep a close eye on this issue, but this concern has receded recently. Lending practices have been tightened considerably, and many lenders have become quite risk adverse. Well, no. The point I'm making to the coalition MPs that I talk to on a regular basis are saying the debt is still, just because you won the election, the debt is still here. It is the biggest ever. Now, part of the issue for, and we should do a future post about this, the whole framework, the whole research thesis of Philip Lowe has been that if debt grows too fast, that is an issue that could lead to a crash. But debt, so they look at, for example, if there's a frog in boiling water, they look at how quickly are we cooking the frog, not whether the frog is overcooked or undercooked. And that's the issue. This is why Guy Dobell last year said we don't know what level of debt is too much debt, because that's not part of their framework, the level of debt. It's just about, is debt growing too fast or too slow? And this is the complete wrong way to think about it. But no, household debt is a big issue. Because it's interesting he makes this statement, because you've got the APRA decision on the 7% rule, which they're going to shift. And then separate to that, in our last post, we talked about how the banks have really opened up lending just because of the election result. And we had mortgages denied before the election and now passed after the election. So the lending practices, independent of these interest rate decisions, I mean, they have changed, and they will change going forward. So again, we will have an economic catastrophe because of too much household debt. And just to give you an example, so when we did the show with Eddie Hobbs, one person in the comments criticised and said, well, because the title was "The Irish are convinced that we're going to have a systematic collapse," and one person said, well, that's not the Irish, it's just Eddie Hobbs. Well, we said at the beginning of the episode, I've spoken to many Irish immigrants, and I spoke to a new Irish immigrant yesterday who bought a house in 2006 in Ireland, got effectively wiped out, left Ireland, is now living in Sydney. And I said to him, what is your feeling about Sydney today compared to Ireland in 2006 when you bought this property? He goes, exactly the same. So again, this is not just Eddie Hobbs. These are, it's Eddie and a whole host of Irish immigrants in Australia who lived through it there, who can see it here and say it is the same propaganda, it's the same psychology among the people, it's too much debt, it's too high level house prices, and this is not sustainable. That's the Armageddon. And obviously the Armageddon for me was not just the Australian debt bubble, but we have a global debt bubble with global debt more than 80 trillion more than October 2007. So again, there is no historical precedence to say that this is sustainable or this is going to end up in a benign outcome.
Yeah, but surely people will argue that serviceability is not a problem because rates are getting ever lower, which means that people can afford even bigger debts. So isn't that a countervailing argument?
Well. So you got two issues there. You got people with existing debt. Now we know that the banks in the serviceability calculations completely rigged the calculations. Now, a lot of people are struggling with debt, yep. And obviously mortgage stress is an indication. So could lower rates, if they are passed on by the banks, could that alleviate some pressure in the short term? Potentially. But obviously, on the other hand, the governor wants the other costs in the household budget to go up, like petrol, like childcare, because they need this 2 to 3% target. So on the one hand, you're going to reduce the interest costs, and yet on the other hand, all these other costs in the budget, the governor wants to go up, number one. And then obviously number two is, even though rates may be lower, and your serviceability criteria for the banks may change under APRA, well, how much additional debt, because you've got the existing borrower and then you've got the new borrower. Well, the new borrower is just likely to get themselves into way too much debt. And who are those new borrowers? Largely first home buyers, and a whole bunch of young Australians who have bought into the mainstream propaganda and are going to be hapless victims when this whole thing blows up.
Sure, and that's why when I measure mortgage stress, I don't just look at the mortgage repayments, I look at the total household balance sheet, right?
Yeah.
So the point is, we know that there are, and the Reserve Bank has already said, there are more than 30% of households who have less than 1 month's wriggle room in their cash flow.
Yeah.
But they've said that.
Yeah.
Right? It's pretty consistent with my numbers. Mine's at 31.9%. So it's not as though the mortgage stress data is way off whack, right? We've got to look holistically. You can't just look at the mortgage part of the puzzle. And that's, I think, a critical point that many people have missed.
Yeah. So we have this decision now. Where we're going to go from here? So effectively, some of the markets are saying that we're going to have another rate cut, and effectively the RBA has sort of signalled that they're willing to go from 1.25 down to 1. Now, Westpac has said that they expect 3 rate cuts this year to 0.75, and JP Morgan last week, and it was backed up by AMP yesterday to say they expect the official cash rate to be 0.5% by mid-2020. Now, this is before the crisis. Now, one of the key things on this is the International Monetary Fund. So when they've talked about negative interest rates, when they've talked about unconventional policy, one of the points they've made is when you go into a severe recession, you need 3 to 6% runway in terms of monetary policy, in terms of interest rates, to be able to stabilise the economy. So there was a blog around this negative interest rates topic, and this blog was published on 5 February 2019. So I want to read the quote from the International Monetary Fund. So this is the quote: "Severe recessions have historically required 3 to 6% percentage point cut in policy rates. If another crisis happens, few countries would have that kind of room for monetary policy to respond." So before the crisis, the RBA is running out of bullets. And when the crisis happens, well, just say we get to next year and it's 0.5% official rates, and then the crisis happens in the second half of 2020. Well, if the International Monetary Fund, and they're not perfect by any measure, because they're the ones that said we're having a soft landing, the Irish are going to have a soft landing before 2007. So these guys are not perfect, but these non-perfect international economists are saying you need 3 to 6%. Well, if we're at 0.5% and we have a recession, where's policy going to go?
Yep. Well, we're out of runway, which basically means then you've got to try and grab other unconventional policy levers to be able to try and support the economy.
Exactly. So I got an email over the weekend by someone in the banking industry who I've recently met. He heard there are wild rumours in the banking industry, particularly in Sydney. Last week, a senior official at the RBA had a closed door meeting with industry insiders, particularly at the banks, and what they discussed, and just to confirm. So I've heard this, and once I heard this, I called you and said, Martin, have you heard this? And you said, you've heard from your own sources. So This meeting did happen. The RBA and the banks met privately, behind closed doors, no democratic consent. Unconventional policy was discussed. Negative interest rates, the RBA indicated that they will go negative. They will do, well, we already know they're going to do QE because Guy Debelle in December said they're going to do QE, but the RBA apparently in this meeting said that they were willing to do negative interest rates first, then do QE, and we know that the banks and some academics are saying helicopter money, and then you have MMT. And I know there's a divided opinion among the audience about MMT, but we did a show about MMT last year, and I think we'll do another post about MMT soon about this. But there can be no question that there was no mention from the coalition, or Labor, or the Greens. There is no mandate for negative interest rates. There is no mandate for QE. There is no mandate for any of these wild radical monetary theories, and yet they are going to be launched on the Australian people in the next 2 years, these things are, in my view, these things are horrific because they cause real pain to real people, and once you start these things, you can't go back, because if you do go back, the pain of unwinding these policies are horrendous. More so than anything that Australians have seen in living memory.
Sure, and of course it's interesting that the Fed has just come out. Of course they did QE a decade ago and are still doing QE. They tried to unwind it and then couldn't, and they've said they're going to do more QE and cut rates further. But they're now saying that QA is now going to be a standard part of their toolkit. So it's no longer unconventional.
Exactly. So after the GFC, Ben Bernanke was in front of Congress because QE effectively is the government printing money to buy bonds. government bonds or residential mortgage-backed securities or bank bonds, corporate bonds, etc. So they print it because there's insufficient private sector demand in order to buy the bonds, and you want to prop up those bonds up to push interest rates down, so you can push the economy further along in the bubble. So that's the purpose of it. Now, African third world countries historically have tried this sort of stuff. It leads to hyperinflation, runaway inflation. Ben Bernanke was asked in front of Congress, are you engaging in debt monetization? And he said no, because he said, if QE was permanent, that would be debt monetization. We're just going to do this temporary, and we can reverse it whenever you want. So whenever we want, we can reverse it. Well, here we are 10 years on. They went from the US Federal Reserve balance sheet. They went from 800 million to 4.5 trillion. They've now come back to 3.9 trillion. So they've unwound 600 million, and they can't go any further because the whole global economy would collapse if they kept on going further. So now, and even Trump has called for more QE, and now they said it's, rather than being unconventional, it's now conventional. So the reason why they can't unwind it is because there's a lack of private sector demand for US treasuries or corporate bonds, etc. So when they say they're going to do QE in this country, when you start it, you cannot reverse it because there's a lack of demand for those securities or bonds or whatever the case may be. So again, you've got this sort of policy direction. But I had a confrontation with a coalition MP via a series of messages about this, particularly on the negative interest rate in terms of situation. Because again, the coalition did not go to the electorate in the election and say, this sort of policy is going to be on the table, and yet the government is about to launch this sort of policy. So I have a conversation here between me and the coalition MP. So I've recorded it, and I'll read what the conversation had. So this is me to the coalition MP. Quote, I just had a solid tip that your government is going to roll out negative interest rates. I hope you are proud. There is nothing free market about this. It is out and out theft of depositor money. Coalition MP comes back and says, that's the RBA, and I took them about it last year. And then I went back and said, the RBA is part of the executive branch of the Commonwealth. Parliament is ultimately responsible. Coalition MP says yes, and we have given them independence. And in the case, you know this, I know this, and I'll be very clear about my view. And then I went back and said, the RBA is out of control. They are extreme Keynesians. Independence doesn't mean accountability. Parliament is just a rubber stamp, a hopeless situation. So this is important. Now, the US Federal Reserve is not a government institution. It's a private bank. There are all sorts of conspiracies, and I have this book here, The Creature from Jekyll Island. Some of the readers would have said this, read about this, the involvement of JP Morgan and a whole bunch of other shady characters in the banking sector that set up the US Federal Reserve system, and what that central bank has done in the United States. Now, I think prior to World War II, the Bank of England was a private central bank. The Central Bank of Italy is private at the moment. So now, the Central Bank of the Bank of England is now was nationalised by the British Labour Party, and so it's a government institution. But because I've had a number of questions and said, what is the status of the Reserve Bank of Australia? Well, the Reserve Bank of Australia was created by a statute of Parliament. So before the RBA, the Commonwealth Bank had that central bank role, but the RBA is not private. It is government owned. It is accountable to the cabinet. It's under the Treasury portfolio. Ultimately, as a Commonwealth institution, it answers to Parliament, and Parliament is ultimately responsible for the decisions of the Reserve Bank. Now, it is true that since '98, the Howard government started this about giving the Reserve Bank independence about making policy decisions, because there is some academic literature to suggest that politicians, when they get involved in monetary policy decisions, they will, you could see higher rates of inflation compared to if you leave it to technocrats. But just because you've given independence, I mean, what we're seeing now is a complete lack of accountability, because no tough questions from the press, no tough questions from Parliament. The RBA governor can basically do what he wants with existing policy and some of this unconventional policy, no democratic mandate, and yet, thing is, the RBA is responsible to Parliament, and Parliament represents us, and if the Parliament won't hold the RBA to account, I mean, look, it's ultimately up to us to apply pressure and say, we didn't give you consent to do this, and we don't accept these sort of policies because this is not responsible policy.
And of course, as things evolve and as they go further and further down this rabbit hole, as it were, they're going to go more and more towards protecting their own interests rather than the interests of the broader population. Right?
Yeah.
So the question I always have is, so what is the RBA there for? Right? It isn't just there to keep inflation between 2 and 3%. Right? It should be there to protect the interests of normal, ordinary Australians. And at the moment, they're going precisely in the wrong direction.
So the legislation says stable prices, full employment, and the welfare of the Australian people. Well, when you've got the biggest debt bubble in the history of the country and they're going to inflate it to astronomical proportions, I would argue that the welfare of the Australian people is not being served by current policy and by this whole direction in terms of future policy. And we're starting to see some big movements in terms of the market's reaction, because the ultimate discipline that could effectively be applied on the RBA is the market. And so which market is actually applying this it is the gold market. So even though that some of our followers are big followers of crypto and a whole bunch of other sort of alternative currencies, I mean, last night for a brief moment in time, the gold price an ounce of gold in Australian dollars went above $1,900 for the first time in Australian history. So we are, silver market hasn't really moved yet, and people know that I'm sort of involved in that sort of space. But the gold market is starting to indicate a dissatisfaction with the direction of policy, with the quality of economic management in this country, and once you see people lose confidence in economic conditions and economic management, there's a rush to something other than fiat currencies, whether it's gold, silver, maybe Bitcoin this time, maybe something else. But the gold market is indicating at this stage a dissatisfaction with the RBA's management of the currency, and I think we'll see gold and silver prices go further as more people become more dissatisfied with what's happening in this country.
Yeah, I sort of may agree, but I think I should just say that I don't necessarily hold the view that you do, that gold is safe, because gold is traded in precisely the same way as all the other commodities and other currencies and interest rates, and they are actually also dominated by those same big international players.
Correct.
Who control the price of gold and who hold vast quantities of gold. So people shouldn't think, I think, that gold is automatically the safest alternative, right? There are risks in the gold sector too.
There is nothing in economics, or there's nothing in the financial world that is risk that does not carry risk. Yep. So I've never claimed that anything is risk-free. Even though that academically they try to argue about risk-free rates and risk-free assets and all of this. No, I mean, there is a risk and there's massive manipulation in the gold and silver market. So I'm the first to acknowledge that the international price is rigged. But even with that rigged price, we saw the highest price for gold in Australian dollars in Australian history last night, and that's not a good sign going forward in terms of what is the market signalling about their confidence in the RBA.
Sure. And if we sort of run the film forward then now, John, so let's assume that the Reserve Bank continues to cut. They go into these unconventional spheres, right? Chances are we're going to start seeing inflation starting to rise, right? And we're going to see the economy struggle. So how does this play out?
Well, how does it play out? Well, 2 points. When you say we'll start to see inflation, well, I mean, if we throw the CPI out the window, I think we can say that we have inflation.
Right.
Because how do we know inflation? Because we're seeing massive asset price inflation, number one. But number two is the people themselves saying we are struggling to live with our wages. So where does that happen? That happens when you have an inflationary environment. Now, with my six pathways to economic Armageddon, and I had laid out these 6 scenarios for news.com. One of them was stagflation, so lower growth, higher rates of inflation, whether they're acknowledged by the government or not. And Alan Greenspan and Mario Draghi have said that stagflation, it could be a scenario that we could see, and if they continue along this line, that could be the environment in which we find ourselves is. And I was born in 1981, but a lot of Australians who lived through the 1970s said it was relatively unpleasant compared to the economic nirvana that Australia had in the 50s and 60s.
Sure, yeah. So there are people, and I tend to be one of them, that says we could end up with a Japanization of our economy, which is effectively very low growth, very long periods of time, low inflation, low wages, and basically grind. So that's one option, right? Another option is that we start to see the inflationary pressures come in, and effectively it gets out of control. Inflation goes very high, so we almost become like a banana republic.
Yeah.
And I can remember the 70s when inflation was remarkably high, and everything had to be inflation accounted. And your wages went up 5% a year, but that wasn't real. That was just to account for the inflation. I remember that. That wasn't fun, I can tell you.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that either of those extremes, and they're both potential future that we could be looking into, are going to be really uncomfortable for most people.
Exactly, so I really have to bring up this point. So, we continue to hear nothing from the mainstream media about any of these issues. You had Bill Evans, the chief economist for Westpac, being quoted in the Australian Financial Review yesterday, saying that the RBA governor is the finest economist of his whole generation. So, I just want to read this quote because, again, this is mainstream propaganda propping up the system, and there is no rational basis for this quote. So the quote is, Bill Evans, chief economist from Westpac, from my perspective, he is he as in the RBA governor is the best economist of his generation in this country. The quality of economic debate has been lifted to new heights as Phil has progressed through the bank, as in the RBA. I find the insight he provides in his speeches quite remarkable. That is complete BS. The most reckless policy in Australian history. He has, when he gave his National Press Club address in February, and he said that house prices rising was all due to immigration, nothing to do with debt or monetary policy. His own research paper by Professor Tulip basically said that he was wrong. So he lied on the public record. The RBA has lied to Parliament about this whole gold situation. Philip Lowe last year said that we do regular checks about Australia's gold, and in 20 years they've only walked into the vault once. So there's massive. There's massive lies, massive, poor policy coming from the RBA, and you get these puff pieces in the AFR saying he's the finest of our generation. Well, I think he's one of the worst of our generation. And privately, I've spoken to one of his professors, one of the professors that taught him in the 80s, and then they sort of said to me, he sort of lost his mind, as in the governor. So he's supposed to be the master, but the master that taught the student, saying the student has lost his way, and these policies are just completely taking the country in the wrong direction. So again, these statements, these articles, all of this non-reporting about the real issues, and everyone saying that isn't the RBA great? I don't understand this. I had some time recently with an ABC journalist who was at that National Press Club address in February, and I asked the journalist, why did you not ask the governor a tough question? And the journalist said, no, I didn't. And I said, no, bullshit, you didn't. There are some obvious tough questions to really put the acid on the governor, and yet there is no appetite from the press to actually ask any questions, and I still don't understand why. And I had some politicians, actually a politician told me recently, and they were sort of questioning, why isn't the RBA getting more heat? And I'm saying, well, but you're in the system. You tell me. I'm lost for words as to why can't the Economics Committee in the House of Representatives or the press really ask some serious questions of the RBA? Because you give me half an hour with the RBA governor, I'll tear him to bits because again, using his statistics, using economic history, there is no way he justifies that this is responsible policy. There is no way. So I'm just lost for words about what's really going on.
Okay, John. So the ultimate question here is, where does this all end up?
Sure. So So I think the average Australian needs to start picking up some of the history books and just look at, if we see massive amounts of currency debasement, huge money printing, etc., and we do see runaway inflation, again, whether it's acknowledged or not acknowledged by the government, well, where can this lead to? It leads to civil unrest. It leads to, what caused the French Revolution? People in Paris couldn't afford to eat bread. What caused Tiananmen Square? It was actually people suffering with Chinese students suffering with inflation. What caused the Arab Spring? Wheat prices that were going out of control in Egypt in 2011. So there are huge consequences. So when you have a government that people don't trust, economic policies head in the wrong direction, you've got cost of living pressures, and people are struggling to survive economically, it leads to social breakdown, it leads to political breakdown, and you start to get into a whole host of really ugly situations. Now, obviously, none of us wish for Australia to end up in one of these extreme situations, and the Australian people don't have that sort of nature. But you poke the bear too much, and who knows where how the financial pressures among the population may manifest itself throughout society.
Right. So what we're really saying is that there is a thematic that says he's doing a set of things. There's no sense to them. They're not logical. They're not appropriate from an economic standpoint.
Correct.
Right? And they're damaging the economy and they're damaging households. And yet everybody in the mainstream just says, well, that's fine. We'll just go with it.
Exactly. So so the title of the episode is about the economic emperor. So for me, he is the RBA governor, Philip Lowe. He is effectively, and it's a radical concept, but people need to think about this. You have a guy that has full economic power in this country. He gets no tough questions. He's not accountable to anyone. No one will question his decisions. He will never be sacked. He'll never go to jail for maladministration. And so, in my view, the governor has totalitarian, dictatorial economic powers. He is a law unto himself. He can do whatever he wants. He has caused enormous economic hardship to date with the middle class suffering with these cost of living pressures and these asset bubbles. And yet, when he exacerbates these going forward, he will do whatever he wants. People will suffer. People will suffer before something blows up. When something blows up, that's if it's like Ireland, that's when you literally will have suicide. That's literally when you will have a massive amount of domestic violence and hunger and real hardship. And this guy basically says, he has all the power and he has no responsibility. And that to me is the real political crime in terms of what we're seeing what we're seeing in terms of Australia. We're supposed to be a democratic country. We're supposed to have Parliament. Parliament has to have all sovereignty, and yet Parliament is weak and a rubber stamp when it comes to this individual at the central bank. He's taken the country in a completely wrong direction.
Okay, so then the question, John, is there an alternative approach to being the emperor, right? Could you have a benevolent emperor instead?
Well, yes. So in my view, we have an out of control emperor who has full power that's taking the country in a completely wrong direction. But many years ago, there was an emperor who really didn't want to be emperor, and he was actually quite benevolent, and he talked about how the people need to come together in order to stand up against perhaps malicious totalitarian forces. And so why don't we hear from that emperor?
The dictator of Tomania, the conqueror of Austerlitz, the future emperor of the world. Speak. I can't. You must. It's our only hope.
I'm sorry. I don't want to be an emperor. That's not my business. I don't want to rule or conquer anyone. I should like to help everyone if possible. Jew, Gentile, black man, white. We all want to help one another. Human beings are like that. We want to live by each other's happiness, not by each other's misery. We don't want to hate and despise one another. In this world there's room for everyone, and the good earth is rich and can provide for everyone. The way of life could be free and beautiful, but we have lost the way. Greed has poisoned men's souls, has barricaded the world with hate, has goose-stepped us into misery and bloodshed. We have developed speed, but we have shut ourselves in. Machinery that gives abundance has left us in want. Our knowledge has made us cynical, our cleverness hard and unkind. We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity. More than cleverness, we need kindness and gentleness. Without these qualities, life will be violent, and all will be lost. The aeroplane and the radio have brought us closer together. The very nature of these inventions cries out for the goodness in men, cries out for universal brotherhood, for the unity of us all. Even now, my voice is reaching millions throughout the world. Millions of despairing men, women, and little children, victims of a system that makes men torture and imprison innocent people. To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish. Soldiers, don't give yourselves to brutes, men who despise you, enslave you, who regiment your lives, tell you what to do, what to think, and what to feel, who drill you, diet you, treat you like cattle, use you as cannon fodder. Don't give yourselves to these unnatural men, machine men with machine minds and machine hearts. You are not machines, you are not cattle, you are men. You have the love of humanity in your hearts. You don't hate, only the unloved hate, the unloved and the unnatural. Soldiers, don't fight for slavery, fight for liberty. In the 17th chapter of St. Luke it is written, the kingdom of God is within man, not one man nor a group of men, but in all men, in you. You, the people, have the power to create machines, the power to create happiness. You, the people, have the power to make this life free and beautiful, to make this life a wonderful adventure. Then in the name of democracy, let us use that power. Let us all unite. Let us fight for a new world, a decent world, that will give men a chance to work, that will give youth a future and old age a security. By the promise of these things, brutes have risen to power, but they lie. They do not fulfill that promise. They never will. Dictators free themselves, but they enslave the people. Now let us fight to fulfill that promise. Let us fight to free the world, to do away with national barriers, to do away with greed, with hate and intolerance. Let us fight for a world of reason, a world where science and progress will lead to all men's happiness. Soldiers, in the name of democracy, let us all unite!